"That food is not for people like you," Chelsea Whitmore said, and the whole restaurant seemed to forget how to breathe. The words landed first, sharp and cold. Then came the soft plastic sound of the takeout container slipping from Loretta Hayes' hands, tipping sideways, and falling open against the edge of the trash can. A little steam still rose from the mashed potatoes. The smell of gravy and cheap roast beef drifted up for one sad second before Chelsea pushed the rest of the meal down into the bin with two manicured fingers and turned away like she was clearing clutter off a desk. Nobody spoke. Not the man in the corner booth with the coffee gone cold in front of him. Not the mother near the window, trying to keep her little boy busy with crayons. Not even Tia Bennett behind the register, whose hand froze halfway to the receipt printer as if the machine, too, had gone silent out of shame. Loretta did not lunge for the food. She did not argue. She stood there in her faded brown coat with the sleeves rubbed pale at the elbows, one hand still curled around the empty paper bag she had brought in from the ring. Her shoes were old, the leather soft with age, and one of the laces had been knotted twice. A few drops of water clung to the silver coils at her temples. She looked at the trash can, not with panic, not even with anger, but with a kind of tired stillness that made the fluorescent lights above seem harsher than they were. Outside, a March wind rattled the glass door hard enough to shake the little brass bell. Inside, the place smelled like fryer oil, bleach, and biscuits that had been sitting too long under a heat lamp. Chelsea straightened the name tag on her blouse and folded her arms. She was the kind of woman who wore authority like perfume, something sharp and expensive that entered a room before she did. "You can't sit here all afternoon over one meal," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice polished into that dangerous kind of politeness that always cut deeper than yelling. "We have paying customers." Loretta lifted her eyes then, slow and steady, and looked directly at Chelsea for the first time. There was no fear in them. That was what unsettled Tia later, not the humiliation, not the silence, but that calm. Loretta looked like a woman who had outlived other people's cruelty before breakfast. Tia swallowed hard and reached beneath the counter for a stack of napkins she hadn't been asked to bring. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her gums. She had seen customers treated badly before. She had seen people ignored, rushed, talked down to, watched too closely if their clothes looked too worn or their pockets too empty. But this felt different. Maybe it was Loretta's age. Maybe it was the way her thin hands trembled just once and then went still. Or maybe it was because there was something dignified about the woman that made the whole thing feel uglier, like watching someone track mud across a church floor. Loretta glanced toward the booth near the wall, the one she had chosen because it was half hidden beneath a framed black and white photo of the town from 50 years ago. Her coat was still draped over the seat. Beside it sat a small white envelope, carefully sealed, and a pair of reading glasses folded on top of a paper placemat. She had come here for a reason. You could feel that much. Chelsea stepped closer to the table and tapped the edge of it with one fingernail. "Ma'am, I need you to leave." The bell over the door gave another small shake, though no one had entered yet, and Loretta finally spoke, her voice soft enough to make everyone else lean into the quiet. "Child," she said, folding the empty paper bag flat in her hands, "you should be careful what you throw away." For a moment, nobody moved. Chelsea's expression did not crack, but something in her eyes flickered, quick and unwelcome, like a light bulb fighting to stay bright. She gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they want the room to believe they are still in control. "I am not throwing away wisdom, ma'am," she said, smoothing the front of her cream blouse. "I am throwing away food that has already been paid for and eaten over." The lie sat in the air, thin and ugly. Tia knew it. The man in the corner booth knew it. Even the little boy by the window looked up from his crayons with the solemn stare children get when adults do something they know is wrong. Loretta said nothing right away. She only lowered her eyes to the white envelope on the booth seat, picked it up with careful fingers, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. Then she reached for her reading glasses and folded them into the same pocket as if she had all the time in the world. Her movements were unhurried, almost gentle, and that gentleness somehow made Chelsea harsher by comparison. "You need to go," Chelsea said again, more quietly this time, because the performance had stopped entertaining even her. Tia grabbed the napkins at last and stepped out from behind the register before she could talk herself out of it. "Ma'am," she said, her voice catching at the edges. I can clean that up for you. And I can get you something else. On me. Chelsea turned so fast the gold hoops at her ears flashed under the fluorescent light. Tia. She only said the name once, but it carried the weight of a warning, payroll, rent, and every fragile thing that came with being 23 and one bad week away from losing your footing. Tia felt her cheeks burn, but she did not step back. Loretta looked at her then, really looked at her, and the lines around the old woman's mouth softened. That is kind, she said. But kindness should not have to whisper. Tia swallowed. She wished she had not heard that line, because now she knew she would remember it for years. Outside, rain slid down the front windows in long silver threads. A delivery truck hissed past on the road, tires cutting through water. The lunch rush had thinned, leaving behind the smell of burnt coffee and damp coats. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer beeped twice and stopped. Chelsea crossed her arms tighter. We are done here. But Loretta was still standing by the booth, one hand resting on the vinyl seat back, her posture straight despite the weight of the day pressing into her shoulders. Tia noticed then that the older woman's gloves were tucked into her coat pocket beside the envelope, neatly folded, and that one of the buttons on her sleeve had been sewn back on with dark blue thread that did not quite match. There was care in everything about her. Not money. Care. The kind built over decades, stitched. By hand, pressed flat, preserved. I only came for 20 minutes, Loretta said, almost to herself. Your cook still seasons the green beans the way Walter liked them. Chelsea blinked. I am sorry. Loretta's eyes drifted toward the framed photograph on the wall, the one showing the diner long before the booths had been reupholstered and before the highway rerouted traffic away from Main Street. In the picture, the sign outside still had its old name. The parking lot was gravel, not asphalt. My husband used to bring me here every March 30th, she said. Back when coffee was 15 cents and people still looked each other in the face when they were speaking. The room grew very still again, but this time it was not from shock. It was from recognition, quiet and uncomfortable. Chelsea glanced toward the photograph as if seeing it for the first time. Tia followed her gaze and noticed an older man in an apron standing near the original doorway, smiling at the camera with his thumbs hooked in his pockets. Walter Hayes, Loretta said softly, almost with a smile. He helped build this place before your shoes were ever on this floor. Chelsea did not answer right away. Her chin lifted a fraction, but the color in her face changed, not enough for anyone to call it fear, just enough to prove she had heard every word. She turned toward the photograph on the wall as if it might rescue her, but it only made things worse. The old image showed a younger version of the diner, sunlight on chrome, two men near the entrance, and a woman in a light dress standing off to the side with one hand on her purse and the other resting on a man's arm. Time had silvered the frame and yellowed the corners, but the shape of that woman's face was still there. The same proud nose. The same watchful eyes. Tia felt a chill move across her skin that had nothing to do with the rain outside. Loretta saw it register in her too, and for the first time, the old woman's mouth curved into something close to sadness. He poured concrete for the back addition in the summer of 1974, she said, her voice low and even. Worked 12 hours a day in August heat hot enough to melt the shine off your car. Hood. Came home smelling like dust, diesel, and black coffee. Said a man ought to leave at least one thing in this town standing straighter than he found it. The diner seemed to shrink around those words. Tia looked toward the kitchen window, where steam had fogged the glass above the pie rack, and tried to picture Walter Hayes in work boots, laughing in the kind of heat that made shirts stick to your back by 9 in the morning. Chelsea tapped her nails once against her folded arm and stopped. If that is true, she said, careful now, choosing each word like she did not trust the next one, then I am sorry for your memories, but that does not change policy. Policy. The words sounded flimsy in the room, too small for what had just happened. Loretta reached into her coat pocket and drew out the envelope again, smoothing its edge with her thumb. No, she said softly. It changes nothing about your heart. That part was already decided before I walked in. Tia looked down fast, pretending to straighten the napkins in her hand, because there was something intimate about hearing a truth land that cleanly. One of the customers near the counter cleared his throat and stood up, leaving a $10 bill under his empty mug. He did not say a word as he passed Chelsea, but the silence he left behind felt louder than a complaint. The little boy by the window tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered something. She nodded, gathered their crayons, and avoided looking at the trash can as she led him out into the rain. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Chelsea noticed the thinning room and set her jaw. "Tia, clean this up. Now." But Tia stayed where she was. Her sneakers felt heavy on the tile, yet something in her chest had settled into place. She was tired of flinching for other people, tired of pretending she had not seen what she had seen. She was still eating, Tia said, barely above a whisper, but in the quiet it carried. Chelsea turned toward her slowly. "Excuse me." Tia's fingers tightened around the napkins until the edges bent. "I said she was still eating." The fryer hummed. Rain tapped the windows. Somewhere far off, beyond the wet glass and gray street, a low engine rolled through town, deep and smooth, followed by another, then another. Loretta did not turn toward the sound. She only slipped the envelope back into her pocket and rested one hand on the booth as if she already knew exactly who had arrived and exactly how late the world was about to realize what it had nearly thrown away. The engines grew louder, a deep, polished sound that did not belong to Main Street on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. It rolled past the hardware store, past the empty bus stop, past the barber shop with the spinning pole in the window, and settled right outside the diner in a low, expensive hush. Every head in the room turned except Loretta's. She stayed beside the booth with one hand resting lightly on the vinyl seat, her shoulders steady, her gaze lowered as though she had long ago learned that important things did not always need to announce themselves to her. Chelsea, on the other hand, reacted instantly. She pushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind one ear, smoothed the sides of her blouse, and lifted her chin with the reflex of someone who had spent years rearranging her face for people she believed mattered. Through the rain-streaked window, black SUVs lined the curb one after another, their headlights cutting pale bars across the wet pavement. A driver stepped out from the first one with an umbrella already open. Then another man in a dark coat emerged from the second vehicle, glanced toward the diner door, and said something into the collar of his jacket. Tia felt the room change again, not with the cruel silence from before, but with a tense, curious waiting. The kind that made forks pause halfway to mouths, and made people suddenly aware of the stains on their aprons and the tone of their own voice 5 minutes ago. Chelsea turned halfway toward the front door and halfway back toward Loretta, caught between performance and uncertainty. "Do you know them?" she asked, and though she tried to make the question sound flat, there was a tremor under it now, fine as a thread pulled too tight. Loretta reached into her pocket and brushed her fingers once over the folded envelope, then let her hand fall. "I know one of them," she said. Tia looked at her, really looked, and saw that the old woman's face had changed almost imperceptibly, not softened exactly, not brightened. It was something quieter than that, something like relief held in check by habit. The bell above the door gave a short metallic shake before the door even opened, pushed by a gust of damp wind from outside. The first man who entered did not stride in with noise or swagger. He stepped inside carefully, umbrella still dripping onto the entry mat, and paused just long enough to find her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, early 40s maybe, with rain darkening the collar of his charcoal coat and city polish in every line of him. But the moment his eyes landed on Loretta, all of that sharpened composure gave way to something human and immediate. "Grandma," he said, not loudly, but with the kind of concern that reached every corner of the room anyway. He crossed the distance between them in 6 quick steps. Chelsea moved instinctively as if to greet him, but he went past her without a glance. Tia saw that part clearly, the way power could choose not to notice someone and make them disappear more completely than anger ever could. The man stopped in front of Loretta and his expression tightened when he saw the empty booth, the missing tray, the damp napkins in Tia's hand, and then finally the trash can near the counter. He did not ask what happened first. He looked at Loretta's face as if checking for harm that could not be measured by bruises or numbers. "You came by yourself," he said, a softness in his voice that did not match the sharp set of his jaw. "I told you to call me if the weather got bad." Loretta gave him the smallest shake of her head. "It is only rain, Marcus." Marcus. The name moved through the room faster than the smell of coffee. Tia knew it before her mind fully caught up. Marcus Hayes, the lawyer from television clips. The one opening clinics on the South Side, funding senior meal programs, standing beside mayors and senators with the same calm expression he wore now in a roadside diner that suddenly felt much smaller than it had 10 seconds ago. Chelsea's mouth parted, then closed. The color drained from her lipstick-bright confidence so quickly it was almost painful to watch. Marcus bent slightly toward Loretta, his hand hovering near her elbow, careful and respectful, as if even concern had to ask permission where she was concerned. "Did you eat?" he asked. The question was simple. The room was not. Loretta looked past him once, toward the trash can, then back up at her grandson. "No," she said gently. "But someone here showed me kindness before the truth walked in." Marcus did not turn right away. He kept his eyes on Loretta for one long second, as if he already understood that whatever had happened in this diner mattered less than making sure she did not feel alone inside it. Then, with a care that made the whole room feel clumsy by comparison, he reached up and adjusted the collar of her coat, where rain had darkened the fabric near her neck. It was such a small gesture that it should have passed unnoticed, but it did not. Tia saw Chelsea see it, and that was the moment the balance shifted again. Real power was not loud. It did not need a raised voice or a sharpened smile. Sometimes it looked like a grandson straightening his grandmother's coat in front of strangers who had failed to see her worth. "Who was kind?" Marcus asked quietly. Loretta's gaze moved toward Tia, and Marcus followed it. Tia felt heat rush into her face so fast she almost dropped the napkins. She was suddenly aware of everything about herself: the coffee stain near the hem of her apron, the ache in her arches from standing since 7 that morning, the way her hair had frizzed at the edges from the rain. Marcus gave her a brief nod, grateful and direct, the kind that did not feel performative. "Thank you," he said. Just that. No speech. No spectacle. But Tia felt the words settle into her chest with a weight that surprised her. Chelsea stepped forward then, because silence had become impossible, and because people like her often mistook recovery for control. "Mr. Hayes," she began, smoothing her voice into professionalism, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." Marcus turned at last. The room seemed to pull tighter around that movement. Up close, his expression was not angry in the wild way people expected powerful men to become when embarrassed. It was worse for Chelsea than anger. It was precise. He looked at the booth, the empty place setting, the damp floor near the trash can, and finally at Chelsea herself, as though arranging the facts in order before deciding how much mercy they deserved. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. The words were even, but there was no warmth in them. Chelsea opened her mouth, then closed it, and tried again. "Your grandmother was asked to leave because of seating limits during lunch service, and one of my staff may have overreacted trying to clear the area." Tia stared at her. The lie was smoother now, iron flat for someone important. Loretta did not interrupt. She stood beside the booth with both hands resting lightly on the back of the seat, her face unreadable, her patience somehow making everyone else look more guilty. Marcus glanced toward Tia. He did not demand. He did not perform outrage. He simply asked, "Is that what happened?" Tia felt the room waiting on her answer. The fryer buzzed in the kitchen. Rain tapped softly at the windows. Outside, another vehicle door shut with a dull, expensive thud. For half a second, she saw her rent notice in her mind, the one folded on her counter at home. She saw Chelsea's clipped smile during staff meetings, the way one bad review could become one bad week, could become no job at all. Then she looked at Loretta, at the old woman's steady face, and understood that fear had been running this place longer than any manager. "No, sir," Tia said. Her voice shook once, and then held. She was still eating. Ms. Whitmore threw her meal away. Marcus did not speak. He only breathed in through his nose, slow and controlled, and looked once toward the trash can by the counter. One of the men who had entered behind him shifted near the door, but said nothing. Chelsea's smile vanished completely. "Tia," she snapped, forgetting herself for the first time, "you do not know how to stay in your place." The words hit the room like a plate dropped on tile. Marcus turned back to Chelsea with a stillness that made the fluorescent lights feel colder. "No," he said, his voice quiet enough that everyone leaned in anyway. "It sounds like she knows exactly where to stand." Chelsea opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. The silence after Marcus spoke was not dramatic in the usual way. It was smaller than that, tighter, like the air had narrowed around everyone in the room, and left no space for excuses. Tia could hear the soda machine humming behind the counter, and the faint tick of rainwater slipping from umbrellas onto the rubber mat by the door. One of the men near the entrance shifted his weight, polished shoe against tile, then went still again. Nobody wanted to be the first to break whatever this moment had become. Loretta did. She laid one hand gently over Marcus's wrist, not to stop him exactly, but to steady the temperature of the room. "Baby," she said, and there was a softness in her voice that took 10 years off his face all at once. "Do not let borrowed cruelty cost you your manners." Marcus looked down at her, and something in his expression eased. Not vanished. Eased. It was the look of a man who had built his life learning when to speak with force and when to speak with restraint, and who still, in the end, listened when his grandmother said his name the way only she could. He gave the smallest nod. "Of course," he said. Then he turned back toward Chelsea, and when he spoke again, his tone was calm enough to make her discomfort even more obvious. "Ms. Whitmore, my grandmother came into this diner in the middle of a rainstorm to sit in the same booth she sat in with my grandfather for more than 20 years. She ordered a meal. She was still eating it. And instead of being treated with basic decency, she was humiliated in front of a room full of strangers." Chelsea tried to recover. Tia watched it happen in real time. The instinctive reach for language, for process, for the thin shield of corporate phrases. "I understand this looks bad," she said carefully, "but we have to maintain standards for all guests. And if there was any confusion in the way service was handled, I am sure we can resolve it privately." Privately. The word felt oily. Loretta's eyes lowered for a moment, not in weakness, but in the kind of tired recognition that comes when people offer secrecy instead of remorse. Marcus noticed it too. "No," he said. "Private is what people ask for when they are embarrassed by being seen clearly." The old neon clock above the pie cooler clicked over to 1:37. Somewhere in the back, a dish cart rolled and stopped. Tia realized her hands had stopped shaking. For the first time all afternoon, she felt rooted inside her own body. Chelsea looked from Marcus to Loretta to the men by the door, trying to decide which version of herself still had a chance here. "I was not aware of who she was," she said at last, and the second the sentence left her mouth, the room changed again. It was not loud. No gasps. No raised voices. Just that collective inward flinch people have when somebody says the one thing that proves everything. Tia saw Marcus's jaw tighten, but it was Loretta who answered. "That," she said softly, "has always been the trouble." The diner went so still that even the rain against the front windows sounded gentler. Chelsea blinked, as if she had expected anger and did not know what to do with truth. Loretta drew in a slow breath and let her fingers slide off Marcus's sleeve. "People wait to find out who matters before deciding how to behave," she said. "That is not respect. That is calculation." Tia felt those words settle into the booths, into the sugar caddies, into the cheap laminated menus with corners worn white from years of handling. Marcus looked at his grandmother with quiet pride, then glanced toward the booth. "You said you came for 20 minutes, he said. "For Grandpa." Loretta nodded once. "March 30th, she said. "He liked the green beans here, even when they were overcooked." A few people in the diner gave a sad little smile before they could stop themselves. Marcus's face softened. "Then you will eat," he said. "And you will sit exactly where you meant to sit." He turned to Tia. "Would you help me with that?" Tia blinked, then nodded so fast a loose curl brushed her cheek. "Yes, sir," she said, and this time there was no fear in it, only purpose. She stepped toward the booth, napkins in hand, while Marcus reached for Loretta's chair as if he were handling something delicate and irreplaceable. Behind them, Chelsea stood motionless beside the trash can, the smell of wasted gravy and cooling bread rising faintly between polished shoes and a spotless floor that had never looked dirtier. Tia moved fast once she had something to do with her hands. She wiped the booth with fresh napkins, then wiped it again, slower this time, as if care could undo what humiliation had already touched. Marcus held the edge of the table steady while Loretta slid back into her seat with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned long ago that dignity did not need permission. The vinyl gave a soft sigh beneath her coat. Rain traced silver lines down the window beside her, blurring the parked SUVs into dark smudges of motion and light. For the first time since Chelsea had lifted that meal into the trash, the booth looked like it belonged to the woman sitting in it. Tia smoothed the paper placemat flat, set down a clean fork and knife, and glanced toward the kitchen window. "I will get another plate," she said. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his coat, but Loretta touched his hand before he could take out his wallet. "Sit down for 1 minute," she said. "I did not wait all morning just to watch you pace." The command was gentle, but Marcus obeyed like he always had. He slid into the opposite side of the booth, his expensive coat brushing against cracked red vinyl that had probably not been replaced since the late 90s. Somehow that made the whole scene more moving, not less. He did not belong there by money or schedule or image, but he belonged there by love, and everybody in the room could feel the difference. Tia hurried toward the kitchen, passing Chelsea without looking at her. The air near the counter still carried the smell of gravy gone cold and wet paper soaking through. Chelsea remained standing by the trash can, one hand pressed against the edge of the counter so lightly it almost looked like she was afraid to leave fingerprints. The hardness in her face had not disappeared, but it no longer looked like strength. It looked like someone finding out too late that composure is not the same thing as character. Behind the order window, the cook, a heavy-set man named Ernie with white eyebrows and flour on his apron, lifted his head before Tia even spoke. "I know," he murmured, already reaching for a fresh plate. His voice was lower than usual. "Green beans, roast beef, mashed potatoes. Extra gravy." Tia nodded. "And warm rolls," she added. "Please." Ernie glanced through the small square window toward Loretta in the booth, and his weathered face changed. "That Mrs. Hayes?" he asked softly. Tia looked surprised. "You know her?" Ernie gave a slow exhale and opened the warming drawer. The smell of bread rose up, buttery and sweet. "Everybody who was here long enough knew Walter and Loretta," he said. "Back before new management started calling kindness a waste of time." He set the plate together with both hands, careful with the portions, careful with the edges, careful in a way that felt almost reverent. Tia took the tray and noticed he had added a small dish of peach cobbler without saying so. "Ernie," she whispered. He shrugged, but his eyes stayed on the booth. "Walter used to fix my truck for free every winter because he said a man should not charge another man for making it home safe." Tia carried the tray out like it mattered, because now she knew it did. As she crossed the floor, the diner had gone quiet in a different way than before. Not tense. Listening. Even the neon beer sign in the far corner seemed too bright for the stillness. She set the plate down in front of Loretta, and steam rose in soft ribbons from the mashed potatoes. The green beans glistened. The rolls shone with melted butter. For 1 second Loretta just looked at it. Then she lifted her eyes to Tia, and something there nearly undid the girl. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. "Thank you, baby," Loretta said. Marcus looked at the peach cobbler and smiled despite everything. Ernie remembered. Loretta's fingers rested near the spoon, but she did not lift it yet. She looked across the table at her grandson, then toward the rain-blurred window, and her voice came out softer than the steam rising between them. "Your grandfather always said a meal tastes different when someone serves it with a clean heart." Loretta let the words rest between them for a moment, as if they deserved their own seat at the table. Then she reached for the spoon, her fingers thin but steady, and lifted a small bite of mashed potatoes to her mouth. The entire diner seemed to exhale with her. It was such an ordinary motion, a woman taking her first bite of lunch, yet after everything that had happened, it felt almost sacred. Marcus watched closely without making it obvious, the way people do when they love someone enough to notice. The little things. Tia saw his shoulders loosen by half an inch when Loretta swallowed, and gave the faintest nod of approval at the plate. "Ernie still remembers the pepper," she said. "Good." The word was small, but it landed warmly. Behind the counter, Ernie pretended to focus on the grill, though Tia could see from the angle of his head that he had been waiting for that verdict like a schoolboy waiting on a grade. Chelsea had not moved much. She had drifted a few feet away from the trash can now, but not out of its orbit, as though the room itself had assigned her a place, and she did not yet know how to step beyond it. Her jaw stayed tight. Her posture stayed straight. But Tia could see the effort in it now, the strain of someone holding a shape that no longer fit. One of the men who had come in with Marcus spoke quietly into his phone near the door, then slipped it back into his pocket and remained where he was, neither imposing nor casual, simply present. Outside, the rain had softened into a fine gray mist that made the streetlights glow even though it was still early afternoon. Cars rolled past more slowly now, tires hissing over wet pavement. Marcus folded his hands on the table and looked at the envelope peeking from Loretta's coat pocket. "You brought it," he said. Loretta dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin before answering. "I almost did not." Her voice was calm, but Tia noticed the way her thumb brushed once against the edge of the table, as if the wood there anchored a thought she had carried in quietly. Marcus lowered his eyes for a second, already understanding there was more weight in that envelope than paper. "You should have called me this morning," he said. "I would have come." Loretta gave him a look over the rim of her glasses, gentle and mildly amused. "And had you storm in here before I even ordered coffee?" she asked. "No, thank you. I wanted to remember this place before the world came with you." A few customers who had stayed pretended not to listen and failed completely. Marcus smiled, but it faded almost as quickly as it came. "You knew I was coming anyway." "Of course I did," Loretta said. "You have never once let March 30th pass without finding me." The date seemed to deepen the room. Tia did not know exactly why until Loretta looked toward the old photograph again and added, 41 years today. The spoon in her hand paused above the plate. 41 years since Walter first walked me into this diner after church and spent his whole paycheck pretending a pot roast special counted as fine dining. Ernie let out a breathy laugh from the kitchen window. One of the older customers near the back booth smiled down into his coffee. Marcus's face softened in that painful, beautiful way love sometimes does when memory and grief live in the same place. "He was showing off," Marcus said. "He had every right," Loretta replied. "He had just asked me to marry him." Tia felt her throat tighten for reasons she could not have explained. There was something about the old woman sitting there in the fluorescent light, coat still damp from rain, speaking of love as if it were sturdy enough to outlast weather, money, and cruelty, that made everything else in the diner feel cheap by comparison. Chelsea shifted then, one heel scraping lightly against the tile. It was the first sound she had made in nearly a minute. Marcus turned his head just enough to acknowledge it, but Loretta spoke before anyone else could. "Sit down, child," she said, without looking directly at Chelsea. "Standing there will not make your conscience taller." The line fell so softly that for a second it almost sounded merciful, but the effect was immediate. Chelsea froze where she stood, and Tia realized the old woman was no longer simply enduring the room. She was now arranging it. Chelsea did not sit right away. The invitation, if it could be called that, landed on her with more force than any accusation had. She looked around as if the room might offer her another version of herself to step into, some cleaner script where she was still in charge, still protected by title, uniform, and the familiar machinery of a place that had always obeyed her tone. But the diner had changed. The old men near the back were no longer pretending not to listen. The woman who had stayed by the window had set down her coffee entirely. Even the rain outside seemed to have thinned into a finer hush, like the afternoon itself was waiting to see what kind of person Chelsea Whitmore would be now that everyone could see her clearly. She pulled out a chair from the table nearest the register and sat with stiff care, knees together, hands folded too tightly in her lap. The motion did not make her smaller, but it did make her look younger, stripped of that managerial sharpness she had worn like armor. Loretta took another bite, chewed slowly, and let the silence do its work. Marcus remained across from her, one hand resting near the edge of the table, his watch catching the weak light from the window. Tia stood near the counter with the coffee pot in both hands, unsure whether to move, relieved not to be told to disappear. "You brought the envelope for a reason," Marcus said after a moment. Loretta nodded and patted her coat pocket again. "I did." She lifted the napkin from her lap, folded it once, and placed it beside the plate with the same neatness she seemed to give everything. "I was going to leave it with the owner." Chelsea's eyes rose at that. So did Tia's. Marcus glanced toward the office door near the pie case, then back at his grandmother. "You came here to leave something for Mr. Bell?" Loretta gave the smallest shake of her head. "No. Mr. Bell sold this place 6 months ago." That sentence moved through the diner like a quiet wind. Tia blinked. Ernie leaned farther into the order window without realizing it. Chelsea's expression changed first to confusion, then to something much sharper. "That is not possible," she said before she could stop herself. Corporate took over administrative operations, but local ownership remained in transition until the partnership vote. Marcus turned his head toward her with sudden attention. "Partnership vote?" Chelsea seemed to realize too late that she had spoken into a room no longer arranged for her comfort. She pressed her lips together, then said, more carefully, "This location is one of 12 under review for a senior meal initiative and community restoration project. The final funding approval has not been announced." Tia stared. Marcus did not. He simply looked at Loretta, and a slow understanding settled between them. Loretta drew the envelope out at last and laid it on the table. The paper was cream, slightly softened at the corners from being carried close to her body through the rain. Her name was written across the front in elegant blue ink, but beneath it was another line, typed neatly and unmistakably official. Hayes Community Trust. Tia felt her breath catch. Marcus's eyes dropped to the envelope, then lifted back to Loretta's face with something like disbelief and admiration braided together. "You were going to do it today?" he said quietly. Loretta picked up her spoon again, but she did not eat. "Walter built part of this place with his hands," she said. "I thought if I ever put money back into it, it should be on the same day he first brought me here." Chelsea had gone very still. The color had left her so completely now that even her lipstick looked faded. "Money," she repeated, the word barely audible. Loretta finally turned toward her, not cruelly, not triumphantly, but with the grave patience of someone who had seen many people fail the same test in different clothes. "Not a little, child," she said. "Enough to decide what kind of doors this diner opens for the next 20 years. The diner did not feel like a diner anymore. It felt like a verdict waiting to be spoken aloud. Chelsea stared at the cream envelope on the table as if paper itself had betrayed her. The fluorescent lights above the counter gave everything a pale, unforgiving clarity. The chrome napkin holders, the smeared rain on the windows, the damp ring beneath Loretta's water glass, the trash can near the register with its lid still tilted slightly open like the room's ugliest witness. Marcus rested 2 fingers on the edge of the envelope, but did not pull it toward himself. "How much?" he asked quietly. Loretta gave him a look that would have been amused if the afternoon had not already cost so much. "Enough that the board stopped calling it a donation and started calling it influence," she said. Tia felt the words move through her like a change in weather. She had heard rich people talk before, in television interviews above the bar at home, in polished speeches that always made money sound clean and far away. But this was different. Loretta did not speak about wealth the way people spoke about status. She spoke about it the way church ladies spoke about cast iron skillets or wedding rings, as something useful only if it had served love for a long time. Marcus leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, and for the first time that afternoon a small smile touched one corner of his mouth. "You were going to surprise me." "I was going to surprise everybody," Loretta said. That was the point. She turned her spoon once through the gravy, then set it down. The Hayes Community Trust was prepared to fund the senior meal wing, the kitchen renovation, and the staff scholarship fund, but only if this place still remembered what service meant. The last sentence settled into the booths like a weight. Ernie took off his glasses in the kitchen window and wiped them with the edge of his apron even though they were not fogged. Tia stood perfectly still with the coffee pot cooling in her hands. Chelsea's lips parted, then pressed back together. "Scholarship fund," she repeated faintly. Marcus nodded once, eyes still on his grandmother. "For employees," he said. "Night classes, certification programs, nursing school, community college, culinary training." She told me she wanted a place where good people could start small and leave with more than a sore back. Tia could not breathe for half a second. She looked from Marcus to Loretta and then quickly away, because hope was such a dangerous thing when you were living paycheck to paycheck that even hearing it out loud could feel like a trick. Loretta noticed anyway. She noticed everything. "There is no trick, baby," she said softly, her gaze moving toward Tia without making a spectacle of it. "Only people, and what they choose when nobody important is supposed to be watching." Chelsea flinched at that. It was slight, but the entire diner saw it. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. Water still clung to the curb in shallow mirrors, reflecting the dark length of the SUVs and the blinking amber from a turn signal left on too long. One of Marcus's associates stepped inside from the front vestibule, carrying a slim leather folder. He did not interrupt immediately. He stood near the door until Marcus looked up, then crossed the room and placed the folder in front of him with a respectful nod. Marcus opened it, scanned the first page, and his expression sharpened again. "The acquisition memo cleared this morning," he said. Chelsea went still as stone. Marcus lifted his eyes. As of 11:15, this diner is no longer in preliminary review. The Hayes Community Trust has controlling approval over the redevelopment agreement. Nobody moved. The old neon clock buzzed softly against the wall. Tia heard a spoon fall somewhere in the back and roll once beneath a chair. Marcus closed the folder and laid his palm on top of it. Which means, he said, looking first at Loretta and then at Chelsea, my grandmother did not walk into a restaurant asking for charity today. She walked into a place she was about to save. Chelsea's face lost what little structure it had left. For a second, she looked less like a manager and more like someone who had wandered into the wrong room and only now realized the door had locked behind her. Her eyes dropped to the folder under Marcus's hand, then to the cream envelope on the table, then finally to Loretta, who sat with her back straight and her meal half finished, looking neither triumphant nor cruel, only deeply, almost painfully, unsurprised. That was the part Tia would remember later. Not the money, not the convoy, not even Marcus Hayes saying the place was about to be saved by the very woman they had tried to shame. It was Loretta's face. The old woman looked like she had met this lesson in 100 different rooms over 100 different years and still, somehow, had not let it hollow her out. Chelsea swallowed, but her throat seemed to catch on the motion. Mrs. Hayes, she said, and now the title came quickly, too quickly, dragged out by fear rather than respect. I did not realize who you were. The words fell flat the moment they landed. Marcus's jaw tightened again, but Loretta lifted one hand slightly, and he let her answer. Yes, she said softly. You already said that. Chelsea blinked, color rising and fading unevenly beneath her makeup. I want to apologize. Loretta picked up her spoon, took one quiet bite of green beans, and set the spoon back down before speaking. The pause made the whole room wait. No, child, she said. You want relief. Tia felt the truth of it move across the diner like a draft. Chelsea looked stunned, as though apology had always been a key in her world, and she had just found a lock it could not open. Marcus leaned back and said nothing. He did not need to. The room had already shifted beyond him. This was Loretta's hour now. Near the kitchen window, Ernie kept his head bowed over the grill, but his ears were turned toward every word. One of the customers by the back booth slowly folded his newspaper and laid it aside. Even the men who had come in with Marcus seemed to understand that whatever happened next would not be decided by contracts. It would be decided by character. Chelsea drew in a careful breath. You are right, she said, each word slower now, heavier. I was wrong. I saw an older woman in a worn coat, sitting too long over one plate, and I decided what kind of person you were before I ever spoke to you. I thought efficiency mattered more than kindness. I thought policy mattered more than dignity. Her voice shook once, and this time nobody mistook it for anger. I was wrong. Loretta studied her for a long moment. Rainwater still glimmered on the outside of the windows, but the clouds had begun to thin, letting in a pale wash of afternoon light that softened the edges of the booths and turned the chrome sugar pours silver white. Tia noticed that the trash can by the counter had finally been closed. She did not know who had done it. She only knew the room felt different for it. Do you know what my husband used to say? Loretta asked. Chelsea gave the smallest shake of her head. He used to say that some people are poor in money, and some people are poor in spirit, but only one of those can make a full table feel empty. Chelsea's eyes dropped. Her hands, still folded in her lap, tightened until the knuckles paled. I made this place smaller today, she whispered. Yes, Loretta said. There was no meanness in it. That somehow made it harder to hear. You did. Marcus's gaze moved to Tia then, just briefly, and she understood he was noticing the difference too, the line dividing one woman from another. One had used authority to humiliate. The other had risked it to tell the truth. Loretta followed his glance. But not everybody did, she said. Tia felt herself go still. Loretta reached for the cream envelope, lifted it from the table, and held it between two fingers worn thin by age and weather and years of doing for others. Marcus, she said, without taking her eyes off Tia, before you decide what to do with this place, I think we already know who the first scholarship should belong to. Tia blinked as if the words had been spoken in another language first and only now arrived in English. The coffee pot in her hands suddenly felt too heavy, too hot, too real. Me? She asked before she could stop herself, And then her face flushed because the question sounded small in a room that had just shifted around her life. Loretta looked at her with the same quiet steadiness she had carried through the whole afternoon, and for the first time since she had walked into the diner, there was something openly warm in her expression. "Yes, baby," she said. "You." Marcus turned in his seat and studied Tia fully, not as a server in an apron, not as background in someone else's decision, but as a person whose choices had already introduced her before her resume ever could. "What did you want to study?" he asked. Tia opened her mouth and closed it again. She had been asked how many hours she could pick up, whether she could stay late, whether she could smile more at difficult customers, whether she could cover Sunday breakfast, but nobody with a straight face had asked her that in years. The diner grew still again, not tense this time, just listening. Tia set the coffee pot down carefully on the counter before she trusted her hands. "Nursing," she said at last, her voice almost embarrassed by the truth of it. "I started prerequisites at the community college 2 years ago, nights mostly, but my mother got sick and then rent went up and I had to stop." Marcus nodded once, taking that in without pity. Loretta's eyes did not leave Tia's face. "Do you still want it?" she asked. Tia laughed softly. "Once, because wanting had never been the problem. Every day," she said. "I still keep my anatomy book in my car, because if I bring it inside my apartment, my little brother uses it to level the broken kitchen table." A few people in the diner smiled sadly at that. Even Ernie lowered his head and let out a breath through his nose. Loretta tapped one finger against the envelope in her hand. "Then, that is settled." Chelsea looked up from her chair, startled by the finality in the old woman's voice. "Mrs. Hayes," she said carefully, "if there is going to be a scholarship program, perhaps there should be a formal review process and an application committee and a waiting period." Marcus glanced toward her, but Loretta answered first. "There will be," she said. "For everybody after the first one." Chelsea fell quiet again. Tia felt tears gather before she could stop them and turned her face slightly toward the counter lights, blinking hard, ashamed of crying in public out of old habit more than actual shame. Loretta noticed that too. She always noticed. "Do not hide gratitude," she said gently. "The world hides enough good things already." Marcus reached for the leather folder, flipped to a blank page in the back, and handed a pen to one of the men who had come with him. "Get her information before we leave," he said. "Admissions records if she has them, transcripts, whatever she needs. If she has to retake classes, we cover that too. Tuition, books, scrubs, transportation. All of it." Tia stared at him, then at Loretta, as if reality had become too large to hold all at once. "I cannot accept all that," she whispered. "Yes, you can," Loretta said. "Because this is not reward money. It is seed money. There is a difference." The line settled over the room, like sunlight finally reaching the floor. Outside, the clouds had broken enough for a thin blade of afternoon gold to slip through the windows and catch the chrome edge of the sugar dispenser on Loretta's table. Dust shimmered in it. The whole diner looked softer than it had an hour ago. Marcus smiled then, small and proud. "My grandmother has been planting people her whole life," he said. "She just does not always warn them first." That drew a real laugh out of Ernie from the kitchen and a quiet one from the back booth. Even Tia laughed through her tears. Loretta lifted her spoon again, took another bite of her meal, and after she swallowed, she looked across the room at Chelsea with neither triumph nor cruelty, only clarity. "And as for this place," she said, resting the spoon beside her plate, "I do not believe in wasting people the way some people waste food. So before anybody loses a job today, I want to know whether this room has learned anything worth saving." Chelsea sat very still after that, the kind of stillness that only comes when a person has finally run out of places to hide inside themselves. The diner held its breath around her. Rainwater still clung to the lower edge of the windows, but the sky beyond them had turned lighter, the gray breaking open in thin pale strips over Main Street. A passing pickup rolled through a puddle outside and left a fan of water across the curb. Inside, the smell of coffee, butter, and warm gravy had replaced the sour sting of embarrassment, though not completely. Some things lingered. Loretta looked from face to face, not searching for guilt now, but for honesty. It was remarkable, Tia thought, how the old woman could make a room feel examined without ever raising her voice. Chelsea finally lifted her eyes. They were no longer guarded in the same way. Tia could not tell whether that meant shame had done its work or whether it had simply gone too deep to cover anymore. I learned, Chelsea said quietly, each word deliberate, that I have been mistaking control for standards. I thought running a clean room meant keeping out anything that made me uncomfortable. I told myself I was protecting the business, but really I was protecting my own judgment from being challenged. She paused and swallowed. And I learned that I have been deciding who deserves softness based on how they look when they walk through the door. Nobody interrupted. Even Marcus remained silent, one hand resting over the closed leather folder, the other near his grandmother's plate. Loretta listened with her spoon laid neatly across the edge of the dish, her expression unreadable in the gentle afternoon light now falling across the table. Chelsea looked down at her own hands. That was wrong, she said, and it was smaller than the kind of place this should be. Ernie cleared his throat from the kitchen window. She is right about that much, he muttered, not unkindly. A faint, sad smile touched Loretta's mouth. Smallness grows fast if you feed it, she said. Then she turned toward Chelsea fully. So the question is not whether you were wrong. We all know that. The question is what you become after you know it. Chelsea blinked hard, as if the sentence had found some place in her not yet armored. I do not know yet, she admitted. But I know I do not want to stay the woman I was an hour ago. The truth in that sat differently than apology had. Less polished. More costly. Tia felt it too. Marcus leaned back slightly and let out a slow breath. Then here is what happens, he said. No one makes a decision today out of humiliation. Not mine. Not yours. He looked toward the men at the door, then back to Chelsea. There will be formal review, retraining, and community service requirements for every manager staying under the new trust, including you, if Mrs. Hayes agrees. Chelsea nodded before he had even finished, quick and almost grateful to be given consequence instead of dismissal. Loretta reached for the cream envelope at last and slid it across the table to Marcus. Fund the renovation, she said. Build the senior meal wing. Set up the scholarship. Keep Ernie's kitchen hot and Tia's future moving. And put one more thing in writing. Marcus uncapped a pen. Name it. Loretta looked around the diner one final time. At the old photograph on the wall. At the clean booth. At the closed trash can. At the young server still trying to understand that her life had just tilted toward possibility. Write this place a rule nobody can misunderstand, she said. If a person walks in hungry, they will not be measured before they are fed. Marcus wrote it down without changing a word. The room went quiet in that soft, full way it does after something true has finally been said. Loretta picked up the warm roll from her plate and broke it in half. Steam rose gently into the late afternoon light. She handed one half to Marcus as naturally as breathing. Then she looked toward Tia, whose eyes were still bright, and gave the smallest nod. Some people serve food, she said. Some people serve dignity. Never confuse the two. Outside, the clouds parted just enough for sunlight to strike the diner windows clean and gold. Inside, nobody moved for a second. Then the coffee machine clicked on, a chair shifted, a spoon touched china, and the room began again, quieter than before, but better.